Yeah. Welcome. My name is Mylan Melodies. I'm here with Gear for Music, and we're today looking at the ARP 2600M. So this is the new resized recreation of the 2600. So the 2600, made by ARP, is an absolutely legendary machine. It is beloved by many. It was originally released in 1971 and was a kind of distillation of the ARP 2500 before it. The 2500 being a kind of massive sort of close encountering super synth, which was modular, and it used clever sliders, this sort of novel slider matrix to do its thing. And the 2600 was an attempt to shrink the 2500. You know, it took the same kinds of concepts and building blocks and found a way to make it portable. Now, actually, the original 2600 is quite a bit bigger than this, ironically, but still portable compared to a modular. And this 2600M is a distilled version of that. So it takes the same circuits that were in the recent 2600 FS and it compresses them. It is the same circuits with some slight differences to make it possible to be this small, such as the sliders are slightly smaller, obviously, than the larger one. And I have to assure you, they are very sort of smooth and solid. It's quite easy to hit particular settings. The speakers are slightly different because they have to be a bit smaller, and the spring reverb is a slightly different design, but still sounds really lush and lovely. But the actual core sound engine is the same as in the 2600 FS that came out recently, and it's just to sort of, without going too nerdy into the provenance of the circuits, it's basically trying to be as accurate to a factory spec 2600 back in the day. Now, there were a couple of revisions of the 2600, several in fact, and one of the main things was a change in filter. And so both filter models, the pre-lawsuit and post-lawsuit, as some have referred to it, which is to say the original filter was based on a Moog ladder, and there was a newer filter design which was not, and both filters are represented. So that's kind of what it is, but what I want to do today is just kind of talk you through the settings, the features, what you actually get with the 2600. And in this little kind of intro jam, we heard a sound. I was sequencing it with the Keystep 37, which is the Arturia thing, which is carrying a neat little ARP logo. Apologies to Arturia. And this is just because you get like a wicked sticker set with it, so you can kind of brand up your keyboard controllers and other things. If I just play, that is the sound that I had going on. And I'll talk you through the panel. I'll talk you through what you get. Basically, you have 3 oscillators on here, and you have these wonderful sliders. Now, I mentioned the ARP 2500, and I did so specifically because the 2500 used sliders too, and it's so clever that ARP found a way to do this, to shrink that sort of immediacy into a smaller portable form factor. Didn't use the same mechanical connections. But because the point with the ARP is I don't need patch cables to make a sound. If I just unplug everything, using these sliders, we can route sounds around the case in a way that is super fast and immediate. And we've got our 3 oscillators here. Oscillators, they're slightly different from one another. All are full range and all can be used as low frequency oscillators. But oscillator 2 has a few more features such as pulse width modulation, and oscillator 3 has a pulse width control, which oscillator 1 does not have. And you just manually squiggle the pulse width control to get different tones. So what you're hearing is oscillator 1, and I can hear it because I've turned it up on the filter mixer. And so the synth is laid out in modules. It really is like a complete modular synth. I would actually say of the semi-modular synths, like the 2600 is by far one of the most feature complete because you've got 3 oscillators, a ring modulator, you've got an amplifier so you can plug in microphones and drum machines and process them, and there's an envelope follower that follows that. You've got noise, a sample and hold circuit, you've got voltage processors that let you invert and mix signals, a lag processor which we'll look at later, and it lets you do clever things like turn the gates that the keyboard turns into or the keyboard makes into envelopes and LFOs as well. You've got two envelopes, an ADSR and an AR, slightly simplified. And then you've got a voltage controlled amplifier, and you've got a mixer here. These can be used as attenuators, and you've got a lovely spring reverb, which is a real, actual spring reverb. So yeah, filter, and we're putting the oscillator into the filter here. The filter, I mentioned there were two different versions. This is the old one. I'll turn down the spring reverb a little bit and just give you a sweep. It's really, really nice, and it picks out harmonics in just like a wonderful, lovely sort of way. There's a second filter. This was the post filter, post lawsuit, as it were. Which also has a lovely sing-songy quality, although there are differences. And I mentioned the sliders because what's cool here is it's just so quick to make things happen. So that's oscillator. And then if I want to frequency modulate the filter with VCO2, it's right there. I've got two control inputs to modulate the filter frequency, and they're pre-wired, but I can use patch cables to break that connection. So there's all of this clever provision that's been put in, and if you look, all of these patch points work together really well. For example, you've got the ability to FM the oscillators against each other. So if I turn up this slider here, I can modulate oscillator 1 with 2, and then there's also the ability to modulate 2 with 1 and 3 with 2. And so you can get this kind of circular FM thing going on. It gets like very wacky. So great for like sound effects and like zingy things. You've also got a ring modulator that allows you to combine the oscillators. It multiplies the oscillators together to create other tones. This is the ring modulator, which is VCO 1 and 2 mixed together. Well, not mixed, but multiplied. So you can make these like really interesting, like clangorous sort of bell things. If you get a nice like plucky envelope going on, it just sounds lovely. But we can do other things, like we can modulate the pitch of the oscillators with sample and hold, which is a kind of randomness, for want of a better term. So just by turning up this dial, fader. And we've got a rate control for that. And if I want that to modulate the filter, what I do is I go from sample and hold output here, and I pick one of the filter inputs. I'm not using this one because it's right faded down. So you can hear that this random circuit is now modulating the filter and the pitch. You can hear it's a bit like clicky. You hear that little click? It's because it's changing instantaneously. It'd be nice if we could smooth that click out, and indeed you can. There is a way, which is the lag processor down here, which smooths out signals. And so if I go sample and hold out into the input of the lag processor, out from the lag processor, back into that control, and then I turn up the lag processor, now, I said to the folks filming this video that I wouldn't do an R2D2 impression, but I kind of have, because it's just happened. They're really happy, I can see. So you can hear how it smooths out signals, and that's an interesting one. There's another couple of applications of the lag processor that maybe aren't so obvious. One, for example, is if I take all this stuff off, and then we go back to just like a slightly more sort of... So with no ring... That's just VCO2. Get it into a nice bass register. Possibly not in tune though, please forgive me. And so we've got the ability to pulse width modulate things. And, you know, you won't see a dedicated LFO per se on the 2600 because the oscillators themselves can act as LFOs. And so we have the ability, we could go from one of the outputs, say I go the sawtooth output of oscillator 3, and I feed it into this input, which is the pulse width modulation input. I turn this right down and turn off the keyboard tracking. You get that nice pulse width modulation sound. Get some filter on that. To get really fat and huge. This just sounds amazing. But what you notice is that I'm using up an oscillator to do that. And that's absolutely fine. That's what they're there for. But you may feel a bit shortchanged and you want to modulate that pulse width without an oscillator, leaving your third oscillator to, you know, fatten up the sound further. And so the lag processor is just amazing because if you look, we've got some other little cheeky outputs like this gate output. When I push a key on my keyboard, it creates a gate from there. And if I run the gate through the lag processor, then it will smooth that gate out and turn it into a kind of envelope. But even better is there is a sample and hold. The sample and hold has its own internal clock controlled by a rate. And that clock has an output. It is there. And if I run that clock through the lag processor, then what it will do is it will smooth it out and it will create a kind of LFO. So I'm going to feed it clock out into the lag processor, and then let's turn up the rate. And so that's just VCO2. That's not smoothed. So now we're getting pulse width modulation and all our oscillators are free. So I turn up this other one. So what I hope this is starting to show is that the 2600 is really well thought out, and these funny little building blocks all have clever functions and can be used creatively to get the functionality that you want. You know, which isn't to say that you might not want like more synths, because who doesn't want more synths, right? But, you know, this works really well with Eurorack stuff. You know, just to give you a bit of a one sort of feature fact about this is that the envelope trigger voltage has been altered in the 2600M versus the FS so that it can trigger with 5 volts, which might not be something that means much if you're not into the modular thing, but a lot of Eurorack modules use the 5 volts as the gate that they output. And so you know that this will interface with Eurorack stuff properly, which is a small but important point because it's shrunk down, it really does feel more like Euroracky in a way. So yeah, that's oscillators and the filters. We've got the envelope generators, which you saw me using. The amplifier. I'm trying to think of some other fun things. Yeah, there is the electronic switch. So the electronic switch is a funny thing where it basically takes an input and it flips the connections it's connected to with every trigger of the sample and hold clock. So that probably sounds a bit confusing, but what I can do is patch something up. So what I do is I will plug the output of my synth, like the sort of mixed output, which is here on the VCA, into the switch. And then what I'll do is I'll plug the output A of the switch into the left input, the left stereo input of the synth. And then I will plug the output B into the right input of the synth. And with a little bit of futzing, I think I should be able to make it so that we get a kind of auto pan effect. Actually, it just is doing it right away. Because the switch is switching every time the sample and hold clock triggers. And we can actually mix in the center reverb as well. Really cool. So there's a couple of other clever little things that we can do, and I want to just sort of focus a bit on the oscillators. And one is that the synth is actually duophonic. So this means that we can play two keys at once, and the synth will split the key playing. So you actually hear like distinct intervals. We do this because we've got these little keyboard CV outs on the synth, keyboard CV1, CV2, and actually noteworthy, there is a mod CV, and what that does is it converts MIDI CC1 into control voltage. So if you connect a MIDI device that has some way of sequencing CC1, then you can use that as a MIDI to CC or MIDI CC to CV converter. And actually, one of the very, very, very cool thing, I have the KeyStep 37 plugged in with a USB cable, and that USB cable is both hosting and powering and receiving MIDI from the keyboard. I'm able to just play the keyboard and it magically takes the MIDI from the USB and powers it too, which I've not seen in another synth. Is super cool. So to make the duophonic thing work, we have to address the two keys individually. So keyboard CV1, I will feed into the keyboard CV input of oscillator 1, and I'll feed the second oscillator 2 CV input with keyboard CV2's output. And I have both of the oscillators up on the mixer. We hear them both in unison because I tune them together. I used a little guitar tuner app on my phone to do it. But if I play them individually, get this distinct interval that you can play the keys and you get intervals. Yeah. It's just really nice. So it's a duophonic instrument, a lot like the Odyssey, actually, for the ARP nerds among us. It's the same kind of capability, and you can do it. So very cool extra feature. Now, on the oscillators, I just want to sort of mention some of the capabilities that you have kind of in close-up, because there's a lot of really clever thought that's gone into the way that the sliders are arranged. That is to say, the default kind of routing when you turn these up with no patch cables. They've just been made very usable and fast, and it's worth looking at here. We've got multiple different waveforms, and some of those waveforms are available at the mixer level, but some we have to patch. So for example, if I wanted to have a sound that's comprised of just two square wave oscillators, we can do that absolutely with VCO 1 and 2, because these are square waves. But we hear VCO 3's saw wave by default, which is very nice. But if you take the patch cable, you can access pulse waves and fade them in. So that's the saw, and then we just push it in and you get the pulse wave. So in that way we can access all these other different waveforms, and we could do things like lag process them, do different things to create LFOs, or we just turn up the sliders. And as I mentioned, there's some really cool little things, some wacky stuff too. For example, oscillator 3 is defaulted to noise, and if I turn up the noise, you get a really crazy effect. Ooh. Really cool. And then boom, that is the ADSR, which is routed as one of the default faders, and it's actually true of all of the oscillators. And this is where one aspect of the 2600 that's so much fun, especially if you have a sampler, which I'm sure you do, if you've got a computer, is using the 2600 to make drums. A lot of these things that are in the oscillators are particularly designed to make them go out of tune, but in really cool drummy sorts of ways. So by having an envelope control the oscillator, we can start to make kind of drum sounds. You know, and also you have the ability to FM the filter. We've got nice snappy envelopes. And I can tune this down so we get a really very low. The other thing you can do is you could take the output of the filter, and our friend, the preamplifier, is not just for external signals. It is also used for internal things too. And you go output of that into the, let's go in here. Ooh. Wow. Yes, so gets fairly intense if you hadn't already guessed, but it's a great way of making drums, toms, other kinds of sound effects. There's a lot of stuff to explore in the normal routing of the oscillators to help you make those kinds of sounds. So if you get one, check that out. There is an envelope follower and a preamp. It would be fun to do something with those, because this is kind of the other thing. You've got a synth that can make lots of different sounds, but the 2600 really is like, came from an era where this was perhaps the only synth you were going to have in your studio, and so you would do everything with it, which is to say that you would also use it as an effects processor. Now, 2600s have been used as effects processors in legendary productions, things like Apocalypse Now, Star Wars, of course, and then also like The Who, you know, Pete Townsend's using the 2600 to get a lot of the kind of chopped, funky kind of guitar effects in an era where, you know, we didn't necessarily have pedals that were so wacky and creative. So what I'm going to do is, if I get that output, is I've got the output of the Roland TR-8S, and if I feed the TR-8S into the preamp, we've got an amplifier, and you can plug mics into this if you have the right adapter. You just need, obviously, a dynamic mic, but you'd get like an XLR to mini jack adapter cable, and there's enough gain. Actually, it's times 10, times 100, and times 1000. And so you can plug in quite low-level things, and you can make them work within the 2600. So this is not particularly low-level. Just stop the sequencer, but start this. That is running. Okay, cool. So I'll turn up some sounds on the TR-8S. So now the TR-8S is going into the preamp. So we can go from the output into the filter. And we've got lots of inputs available. I'll take off the oscillators and I'll just turn this up. And then what I need to do is have it so that it is just coming into the output without me needing to hit the keyboard. So what you're hearing there is that's the drum machine through the preamp, and you're hearing the lovely spring reverb. Now, this is the fun, is overdriving it massively. You hear a little bit of overdrive there. I've got a lot more gain on the actual machine itself, so let's turn this down a bit. So you can really go to town. Turn it down a bit. There's lots of like sweet spots of gain to be had, and if you plug in a guitar you can really amp it up, literally. So we've got a sound in, but we want the sound to sort of be filtered. We want to make use of all of the cool things that are in the 2600. So we've got an envelope follower. Now what an envelope follower does is it creates an envelope that follows the volume of the signal that you're plugging it into. And so it's like a controlled, smooth control voltage that you can use to control parts of the synth. And the filter would be a fine candidate for that. And thanks to the pre-routing, preamp is always going into the envelope follower. And if I go output, I've now got the output of the envelope follower here, and I'll go into one of the modulation inputs and I will turn this up, and we should yeah, there we go. Sorry. You can hear that there's this like very strange thing happening. It's like a little quiver on the end of the tail. And you use the sliders to really fine tune, find a kind of happy sweet spot. So we've created this kind of control signal that we're using to modulate the filter, but we can use it to modulate all manner of other things. And remember, we were playing with like the FM controls where we were able to modulate the things with the oscillators, yes. And we can do that where we can use this control signal to drive the oscillators now. Now I want to send this envelope follower to lots of different places. And so I need a multiple, and a multiple is a way of creating copies. And there is a little cheeky multiple down here. So if I plug the output of the envelope follower into the multiple, I now have two copies. And I can go into, for example, the keyboard CV input. I might give myself some scaling, so I'm going to plug it into the this input here, which is originally the sample and hold by default, and then I will plug the output of the multiple, the other spare output, back in. So we should hear our thing come back to life if I turn it up. But if I fade in, so now you're hearing the oscillator, but it's being controlled. The filter that's acting on the oscillator is being controlled by the drum machine. And if I turn up this slider, we're going to hear the pitch. So now the pitch itself is being controlled by the drum machine as well. And if I turn up other things on the drum machine, weird stuff starts to happen. Let's turn up our Eventide black hole. you hadn't started to gather, this is a source of endless fun. Yeah, it's just really fun. So it's not just a synth, it's an effects processor as well. It's a thing that you use in your studio to process other things, your voice, your guitar, your drum machines, external synths as well. So for example, you know, this is kind of the mad thing. You've got so much flexibility, and this semi-modular capability means that if you've got like a little synth, for example, a synth that might have some CV connectivity, a CV out, CV ins, you can kind of use this as a building block, like a little laboratory that can augment what you already have. Like a really good example of a thing to try is, you know, something like the the Micro Freak from Arturia, which is a synth that's got digital oscillators. It does have an analog filter. You can use a Micro Freak as a kind of super controller for the 2600M because you've got a touch plate controller. You've also then got the oscillators that you can add to the analog oscillators. And so it's an example of how you can, you know, 2600 can be lots of different things, both a sound source, a synth, an effects processor, and also a way of, like, at a piece of a puzzle of building a kind of super synth that you use other parts, you know, that you fit other parts into, if that makes sense. So it's a really powerful machine. And as I say, I think it's one of the most feature complete semi-modular analog synths that was ever made, potentially, other than the Eurorack synth that you might put together yourself. But the difference is, I must say, and as a person with a lot of Eurorack stuff, is that what the 2600 has in spades is immediacy and playability. It's because you've got these sliders, it's very fast to flip the sliders, create routings, discover little interconnections, clever little things you can do. There's usually ways of doing things. You've got the voltage processors as well, which you didn't even touch on, but you can do some wacky stuff like, for example, you can invert the CV so that, let's just try it. Well, you can invert the CV so that this was, I think Joe Zawinul used this one, which was because obviously if you play the keyboard, very traditionally, keyboard starts with, if you play a low note, you get a low note. But because you've got inverters here, you can invert the keyboard response. And so here, if I invert this and feed it into VCO2, now I'm playing the lowest note. Now I'm playing a high note and it's low. Now, I don't really play a keyboard very well, if you hadn't noticed, but it's very weird, but fun, because you can completely invert what you know about a keyboard. And I think Zawinul used this to sort of experiment in a jazz fashion and discover new melodies that he wouldn't have discovered by flipping it on its head. Just an example of the kind of wacky things that you can do with the voltage processors. And they're also just really handy as mixers and utilities to just unlock sounds and possibilities within this circuit, you know, with clever patching. There's loads of stuff you can do. And by the way, one pro tip is if you go on the Korg site, because it's Korg who've made this new ARP 2600, there is a patch book, which is the 1970s, not sure what year it was released, but during the life of the 2600, it was a patch book with like lots, I'm trying to remember, it's at least 50 patches, which are all different clever things that you can do with a 2600. Definitely recommend the Jonathan synthesized seagull patch if you want to laugh, where you can make it sound like seagulls, and there is a control to control the confusion of the seagulls, something that I think someone had a lot of fun deciding. But it's a very, very good resource. So if you do get a 2600, then check out that patch book, and we'll link to it below. We'll link obviously to the 2600 and other suggestions, gear that we've mentioned, and things that you may want to know about. If you have any questions, please do leave them in the comments. Check out the links below, and thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next time.